The first thing my wife said in divorce court was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your Honor, he's just a worthless Marine veteran." You could hear the air conditioner humming after that. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. The entire courtroom just sat there staring at me like I was some old dog somebody had finally decided to put down. I remember looking at Linda for a long second. 32 years of marriage sitting across from me in a pale blue blazer. I'd bought her for our anniversary 5 years earlier. She wouldn't even look me in the eye after she said it. Then I looked at the judge. He had been reaching for his coffee when I spoke. "Morgan," I said quietly, "remember me?" The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. At first he only squinted at me, like he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Then his face lost all its color. He stood up so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Frank Dalton." Suddenly the courtroom didn't feel so small anymore. Linda's attorney, a slick-haired man named Russell Green, looked from the judge to me with growing panic. He'd spent the last 40 minutes painting me as a washed-up burden who had emotionally neglected his wife for years. Up until that moment, he'd been enjoying himself. Now his tie looked too tight. Judge Harold Morgan kept staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. And truthfully, maybe he had, because the man sitting in that courtroom wasn't the same Marine gunnery sergeant who had pulled him out of floodwater 24 years earlier. That man had stronger knees. That man slept through the night. That man still believed coming home from war meant clear-as-throat life would eventually make sense again. The bailiff cleared his throat awkwardly. "Your Honor?" Morgan blinked hard and sat back down slowly, though his eyes never left me. "We're taking a 15-minute recess," he said immediately. Linda finally looked confused. Her lawyer looked terrified. And I just sat there quietly with my hands folded, feeling every mile of my 68 years settle into my bones. That was the moment my wife realized she didn't actually know the man she'd married. But to explain how we got there, I need to back up a little. I grew up outside Jacksonville, North Carolina, in a town where almost every family had somebody connected to the Marines. My father served in Korea. My older brother died in Vietnam in 1970. By the time I graduated high school, joining the Marine Corps didn't feel like a decision. It felt like gravity. I served 26 years. Most of it I rarely talked about. Men my age were raised different. You carried things quietly, especially the ugly things. Linda used to love that about me once. We met in 1989 at a church fundraiser in Wilmington. She laughed at one of my terrible jokes about overcooked barbecue chicken, and I remember thinking she had the warmest smile I'd ever seen. Back then, she didn't care that I drove a used pickup truck with rust around the wheel wells. She didn't care that my dress blues were older than some of the young Marines under my command. She said she liked that I made her feel safe, and for a long time we were happy. Not movie happy, real happy. Mortgage payments? Friday night meatloaf, folding laundry together while watching Wheel of Fortune. Raising our son Michael in a little ranch house 3 miles from the water. But life changes people slowly. So slowly you hardly notice it happening. After retirement, things got harder for me. The nightmares got worse. Crowded grocery stores started making my chest tighten. Some mornings, clear as throat, I'd sit in my truck outside the hardware store trying to convince myself to walk inside. Linda thought I was becoming cold. Truth was, I was tired all the time. Tired in places sleep couldn't fix. But I never learned how to explain that to her. Men from my generation weren't taught how. So instead, I stayed quiet, and silence can rot a marriage just as surely as cruelty can. Over the years, Linda began spending more time with women from her real estate office. Wealthier people. Country club people. Women whose husbands owned dealerships or law firms or beach property. Next to them, I think she started feeling embarrassed by me. An old Marine who volunteered at the VFW and wore the same brown jacket. Everything's got worse after Michael moved to Raleigh. The house became too quiet. Linda started criticizing little things first. The way I chewed, the way I folded towels. The fact that I still drove my old Ford pickup instead of buying something respectable. Then eventually she stopped talking to me unless she needed something. Last year she asked for a divorce over coffee like she was discussing weather. I wasted too many years settling, she told me. I remember nodding slowly, because I honestly didn't know what else to do. You can survive mortar fire easier than some conversations. Still, I never fought her. I let her keep most of the furniture. I agreed to sell the boat. I even offered half my pension without argument. But apparently kindness looks like weakness once people stop respecting you. That was how we ended up in that courtroom. Her lawyer wanted everything: the house, my savings, my father's fishing property near Swansborough. And while I could have hired a better attorney, I honestly didn't care much about money anymore. What bothered me was hearing 32 years reduced to one sentence. Worthless veteran. Funny thing is, those two words didn't hurt nearly as much as they should have, because deep down I knew Linda wasn't really angry at me. She was angry life hadn't turned out the way she imagined. A lot of people our age carry that disappointment quietly. Some marriages survive it, some don't. When recess was called, people immediately began whispering around the courtroom. Judge Morgan disappeared through a side door without saying another word. Linda turned toward me finally. "What was that about?" she asked cautiously. I shrugged. "Old memories." Her attorney interrupted quickly. "Mr. Dalton, do you personally know the judge?" "Not well," I answered honestly. That was technically true. You don't really know a man whose life once hung from your arm in black hurricane water at 2 in the morning. You just remember him forever. Green swallowed hard. Should we be concerned about judicial bias here? I almost laughed at that, because if there was one thing Harold Morgan believed in more than gratitude, it was fairness. That man built his whole career around it. A few minutes later, the courtroom doors opened again. Judge Morgan walked back in slower this time, older than I remembered. Grey hair, reading glasses, a slight limp in his right leg. Life catches all of us eventually, but when he looked at me again, I saw the same young prosecutor from 24 years ago staring back through those tired eyes. And suddenly I knew something important. This divorce wasn't going to be about revenge anymore. It was going to be about the truth. Judge Morgan adjusted his glasses and looked out across the courtroom carefully before speaking again. "Before we continue," he said, "I need a brief private conversation with Mr. Dalton in my chambers." Linda's attorney immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I must object." "You may object," Morgan said calmly, "but I'm still doing it." That shut the room down fast. I followed the bailiff through a narrow hallway lined with faded photographs of former county judges. The courthouse smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. It reminded me of government buildings I'd spent half my life walking through. Morgan's chambers were smaller than I expected. Books everywhere, framed family photographs, a little ceramic lighthouse sitting beside the window. The moment the door closed behind us, he just stared at me. Then he shook his head slowly. "I'll be damned," he whispered. For a second, neither of us spoke. 24 years disappeared between us like smoke. "You got old, Frank," he finally said. I chuckled softly. "That makes two of us." Then something happened I didn't expect. Judge Harold Morgan stepped forward and hugged me. Not formal, not polite, real, the kind of hug older men only give when words aren't enough anymore. "You saved my life," he said quietly. I looked down at the carpet. Long time ago, not to me. He walked back behind his desk slowly and sat down, still studying me like he couldn't believe I was real. "I searched for you afterward," he admitted. "For years, actually. That surprised me. You did?" "You disappeared." I shrugged lightly. "Transferred out west after that storm. Then deployments. Life happened." Morgan nodded slowly. "Life happened." That phrase carries a lot more weight once you pass 60. He leaned back in his chair. "You remember that night?" I gave a tired smile. Every time it rains hard. And just like that, my mind went back to September of 2002. Hurricane Isabel tore through the Carolina coast like a chainsaw. Roads flooded, power failed, boats wound up sitting in grocery store parking lots. People around here still talk about that storm like it was yesterday. At the time, I was stationed at Camp Lejeune as a gunnery sergeant, overseeing evacuation support with a Marine Emergency Response Unit. Morgan was a young federal prosecutor back then. Ambitious, sharp kid. He'd been visiting Jacksonville on some corruption investigation involving military contractors. None of that mattered once the flooding started. By midnight, the highways were underwater. I still remember the radio calls screaming over each other. Families trapped in attics, cars floating into drainage canals, elderly residents stranded in nursing homes. Chaos, complete chaos. Morgan had gotten stuck with several civilians near Cedar Point when floodwaters overtook their vehicles. By the time we reached them, the current was ripping entire trees out of the ground. Our commanding officer, ordered us to pull back until daylight. I didn't. Maybe that was stupidity, maybe instinct. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. I took 2 Marines in an inflatable rescue raft into water that looked more like a river than a neighborhood street. Pitch black, rain slamming sideways, power lines sparking in the distance. I found Morgan hanging onto a street sign, with one arm while holding onto an older woman with the other. He was exhausted, terrified, and still trying to keep that woman above water. I remember yelling, "You let go when I tell you." He shouted back, "Not without her." Even then, I respected him for that. We pulled them out one by one. The last wave nearly flipped the raft completely. I tore something in my shoulder, dragging Morgan aboard. Never fixed right after that. To this day, cold weather still lights it up like a firecracker. Back in the judge's chambers, Morgan opened a desk drawer and removed something carefully wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, I saw my old Marine Corps challenge coin sitting in his palm. I stared at it quietly. I hadn't seen that coin in over 2 decades. "You gave me this in the ambulance," he said. "Told me to remember that surviving means you owe something back afterward." I smiled faintly. Sounds like something I'd say. It changed my life. He wasn't exaggerating either. Over the years, I'd watched his name in newspapers now and then. Assistant prosecutor, state judge, eventually superior court. Fair reputation, no scandals. Around here, that alone was practically a miracle. Morgan leaned forward. "What happened to you, Frank?" That question sat heavy in the room. I could have answered 100 different ways. War happened. Time happened. Funerals happened. The slow loneliness that comes after retirement happened. Instead, I just said I got tired. Morgan understood immediately. Men our age usually do. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Did you really threaten or intimidate your wife at any point?" "No." "Did you hide assets?" "No." "Did you abuse her?" I looked him directly in the eye. "Never." He nodded once. That's what I thought. Outside the window, I could hear distant thunder rolling over the coast. Storm season again. Funny how life circles back on itself. Morgan loosened his tie slightly. "You know your wife's attorney is trying to portray you as mentally unstable because of your military history. That doesn't surprise me. You angry?" I thought about Linda sitting out there. The woman who once danced barefoot with me in our kitchen while Patsy Cline played on a little radio. The woman who sat beside me at my father's funeral holding my hand so tight it hurt. The woman who now looked at me like I was an embarrassment she wanted erased. "No," I answered honestly. "Mostly sad." Morgan exhaled slowly. Then his expression changed. "Frank," he said carefully, "there's something your wife probably doesn't know." I raised an eyebrow. "After you retired, several Marines from Lejeune contacted my office over the years asking about you. Men you helped. That wasn't necessary. Apparently it was to them." He opened a folder on his desk. Inside were letters, dozens of them, handwritten, typed, clear as throat folded with age. One from a former Marine whose addiction recovery I'd paid for anonymously. One from a widow whose mortgage I covered for 6 months after her husband died. One from a young corporal who wrote, "Gunny Dalton talked me out of putting a pistol in my mouth in 2011. I looked away quickly after reading that one. "You kept these?" I asked. Morgan nodded. "People don't forget men like you, Frank." For a moment I couldn't speak, because the truth is, after enough years pass, you start believing maybe people did forget. Then Morgan said something that settled deep in my chest. "The courtroom out there thinks this case is about money," he said quietly, "but I think it's really about dignity." And for the first time since the divorce began, I realized he was right. When Judge Morgan and I walked back into the courtroom together, the entire room went silent again. Not ordinary quiet, the kind of silence people make when they know something important happened behind closed doors, even if they don't know what. Linda looked nervous now. That was new. Up until that morning, she'd carried herself with the confidence of someone absolutely certain she was winning. But the moment she saw Morgan pull out my chair before sitting back on the bench himself, I noticed her expression change. Not fear, exactly. Confusion, maybe even doubt. Her attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like the record to show my concern regarding—" Morgan raised one hand calmly. "Mr. Green, I assure you this court remains fully impartial." Green swallowed the rest of his sentence. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The hearing resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Earlier that morning, I'd been treated like a tired old man standing in the way of his wife's freedom. Now people kept glancing at me like they were trying to solve a puzzle. Funny how quickly respect changes once people think you matter. Linda finally leaned toward me during a pause in testimony. "What did you say to him?" she whispered. "Nothing special. That judge looked like he saw a ghost." I kept my eyes forward. Maybe he just remembered something. Her face tightened. For the first time in years, I think Linda realized there were parts of my life she'd never bothered to understand. The rest of the hearing dragged on another hour before Morgan adjourned proceedings until the following afternoon. Outside the courthouse, clouds rolled low over the parking lot, heavy with incoming rain. Eastern North Carolina in September always smells like wet asphalt and salt air this time of year. I was halfway to my truck when I heard Linda call my name. "Frank," I turned slowly. She stood beside her Lexus, with her purse tucked against her chest like a shield. Older now, lines around her eyes, the same freckles across her cheeks she'd had when we first met. Amazing how age lets you see every version of a person all at once. "What?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "Who are you?" I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, because after 32 years of marriage it was probably the saddest question she could have asked. "I'm the same man I always was," I answered. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think you are." Rain began tapping lightly against the courthouse steps. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she asked the question she'd really been holding in. What happened during that hurricane? So Morgan had told her something already. "People got rescued," I said simply. "That's it?" "Pretty much." Linda stared at me with visible frustration. "Why won't you ever just talk to me?" There it was, the real wound underneath all the anger. Not money, not the house, not even the divorce. Silence, 30 years of silence. I leaned against my truck, carefully feeling the familiar ache in my shoulder. "You really want the truth?" I asked. "Yes. The truth is, I stopped knowing how to explain myself a long time ago." Her eyes softened slightly. "When Michael was little," I continued, "I could still pretend everything was normal. Work kept me busy, family kept me focused. But after retirement, things got louder in my head." She looked down. "I thought you stopped loving me. That hurt more than the courtroom had. Because despite everything, I never stopped. Not once. I just got tired, Linda." Rain fell harder around us. Cars hissed across the wet street nearby. Finally, she shook her head slowly. "You know what the women at work used to say about you?" "I can imagine. They said you were emotionally unavailable, bitter, stuck in the past." I chuckled softly. "They weren't entirely wrong, but I defended you at first. That surprised me. I didn't know that. I did." Her voice cracked a little, but after a while I started believing them too. I looked at her for a long moment. "You know the funny thing," I said. "I spent most of my life terrified somebody under my command would die because I missed something important." She blinked at me. "And somehow I still missed what was happening in my own marriage." Linda looked away quickly after that. For years I'd imagined feeling triumphant if she ever regretted leaving me. Instead, all I felt was exhausted. A few minutes later, she quietly said, "Michael's angry with me." That doesn't surprise me either. Our son had called me the night she filed for divorce. He didn't yell. Honestly, I almost wish he had. Disappointment hurts worse coming from your own child. "You know Dad would never cheat on Mom." He told her over speakerphone while I listened silently in the kitchen. "So why are you treating him like he's some kind of criminal?" Linda told him he didn't understand marriage. Michael answered with something that stuck with me ever since. "No, Mom, I understand loyalty." A week later, he drove down from Raleigh to help me organize paperwork for the attorneys. That was when he discovered I'd quietly sold my old Harley years earlier. "Wait," he said, looking through financial records. "You sold the motorcycle in 2009. "Yep, Dad, you loved that bike." I shrugged. "Mortgage needed paying." He stared at me in disbelief. "Mom never knew." No point upsetting her. Truthfully, there were dozens of things Linda never knew. The security jobs I worked after retirement, when her real estate commissions dropped during the recession, the times I skipped meals on deployment years earlier so younger Marines could eat more, the panic attacks I hid in grocery store bathrooms. Men from my generation became experts at hiding pain. Unfortunately, we also became experts at hiding love. Standing there beside the courthouse, Linda suddenly looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. Like the version of life she'd spent years building in her mind was beginning to crack apart. Then she asked quietly, "Did you really save the judge's life?" I sighed softly. "Linda, that happened 24 years ago. That's not an answer." "No," I admitted finally. "I helped save him." She covered her mouth slightly, and right there I saw shame begin settling into her eyes for the first time. Not because of the rescue itself, because she realized strangers knew things about her husband she never cared enough to ask about. The rain poured harder now. Thunder rolled somewhere over the water. Linda wiped beneath one eye quickly before speaking again. "I found something in the attic last week." "What?" "A box." Immediately I knew which box she meant, the old footlocker. She swallowed hard. Those medals. Those letters. I looked away toward the grey sky. "So you read them?" "Yes." Another silence stretched between us. Then she whispered something so quietly I barely heard it over the rain. I didn't clear his throat, no. And sitting there in that courthouse parking lot at 68 years old, soaked by Carolina rain beside the woman who once knew me better than anyone alive, I finally understood something painful. Sometimes people don't stop loving each other first. Sometimes they just stop seeing each other clearly. The next morning, the courthouse parking lot was fuller than usual. I noticed the pickup trucks first, old Fords, Chevys, a couple battered motorcycles parked near the curb. Men in worn bowl caps stood around drinking coffee from foam cups despite the drizzle. Some leaned on canes, some carried themselves stiffly the way older servicemen often do after years of injuries and hard living. At first I didn't understand why they were there. Then one of them spotted me getting out of my truck. "Morning, Gunny," I froze. The voice belonged to Eddie Navarro, a former Marine corporal I hadn't seen in at least 12 years. His beard had gone almost entirely grey now. Before I could answer, another man nodded toward me, then another. Word had spread. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. I never liked attention. Most veterans my age don't. We were taught to do the job and move on, but somehow those men had shown up anyway. Eddie walked over slowly and shook my hand with both of his. "Heard what happened in court yesterday," he said. "Figured you shouldn't walk in there alone." I looked past him. More veterans kept arriving. Some I recognized instantly. Some took me a minute. One man had once been a reckless 19-year-old Lance Corporal from Oklahoma who nearly got himself killed driving drunk outside Camp Pendleton. I'd spent half a night talking him into handing over his keys. Another had lost 2 fingers overseas. Another had gone through rehab after opioids nearly destroyed his marriage. And somehow every one of them was standing outside that courthouse because of me. So I honestly didn't know what to do with that feeling. "You boys are causing a scene," I muttered. Eddie grinned. "That's the idea." Inside the courthouse, people stared openly as we walked through security together. Not loud, not aggressive, just older veterans quietly taking seats behind me in the gallery. There's something powerful about silence when it's shared. Linda arrived a few minutes later and stopped cold when she saw the room. Her attorney looked even more unsettled. Judge Morgan entered shortly afterward, glanced toward the gallery and understood the situation immediately. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch slightly before he brought the court to order. Proceedings resumed with financial testimony first. Pension accounts, property evaluations, retirement estimates. The usual ugly math people reduce marriages into once love runs out. But underneath all of it, tension kept building. Finally, Green decided to take another shot at me. "Mr. Dalton," he began smoothly, "would you agree that your emotional withdrawal over the years contributed heavily to the collapse of your marriage?" "That's fair," I answered calmly. He seemed surprised by how easily I admitted it. "And would you agree your military experiences left you psychologically damaged?" Morgan looked up sharply at that wording. I answered anyway. "Yes." The courtroom grew quiet. Green pressed forward confidently now. "So you admit you became incapable of fully participating in a healthy marriage?" "No," I said evenly. "I said I carried damage." He folded his hands dramatically. "What's the difference?" I looked at Linda briefly before answering. "The difference is I still love my wife every day." That hit harder than I intended. Linda's eyes immediately filled with tears. Green pivoted quickly. "Love without communication can still become neglect, correct?" He wasn't wrong. That was the painful part. I nodded slowly. Sometimes, yes. The attorney turned toward the judge as if scoring points, but then something unexpected happened. Linda spoke up. That's enough. Everyone turned toward her. Even Green looked confused. Linda sat straighter in her chair, gripping a tissue tightly. You keep talking about my husband like he's some kind of monster, she said quietly. He's not, Green blinked. Mrs. Dalton? No, her voice cracked. For the first time since the divorce began, she sounded tired instead of angry. You want to know the truth? She continued. Frank wasn't cruel. Frank wasn't abusive. Frank wasn't lazy. She swallowed hard. He just stopped letting people see how much pain he was in. The courtroom stayed silent. I honestly think everyone there stopped breathing for a second. Linda wiped her eyes and kept going. And I stopped trying to understand him. Green looked horrified now because his own client was dismantling the case. Morgan leaned back quietly, allowing her to continue. I spent years comparing my life to other people, Linda admitted. Women with richer husbands, bigger houses, fancy vacations. She looked toward me then. And somewhere along the way I forgot who I married. I stared at her without speaking, because after all the bitterness, all the coldness, hearing that nearly broke me. Not from victory, from grief. 32 years is a long time to lose. Green tried recovering control. Mrs. Dalton, perhaps we should refocus on the financial matters. No, she interrupted again softly. I think maybe financial matters are the reason we ended up here in the first place. Then she said something I never expected to hear. Frank sold his motorcycle during the recession to save our house. The courtroom shifted slightly. Green frowned. What relevance does that have? Because I never even knew he did it. She looked down at her hands. He worked night security jobs too. I found the pay stubs last week. I closed my eyes briefly. I'd never wanted her to discover any of that. Not because it was shameful, because I didn't do it for credit. Morgan watched quietly while Linda gathered herself again. Then she reached into her purse and removed a folded piece of paper. I also found this, she whispered. The moment I saw the handwriting, my chest tightened. It was the anniversary letter. I'd written it 6 years earlier, after one particularly bad winter when my nightmares kept waking her up at night. I never gave it to her. Couldn't find the courage. Linda unfolded the paper carefully with shaking fingers. You wrote this. I nodded once. Her voice trembled as she read aloud. I know living with me hasn't always been easy. Sometimes I feel like parts of me never came home from overseas, but I want you to know none of that was ever your fault. I loved you before the war inside my head started, and I still do now. By the time she finished reading, even Green looked uncomfortable. Linda lowered the letter slowly. Then she looked directly at me in front of everyone. Why didn't you give this to me? I answered honestly. I didn't think the words mattered anymore, and that may have been the saddest truth of all. 3 months after the divorce hearing ended, I found myself standing beside the Atlantic again. Not at a courthouse, not in front of lawyers, just the Carolina shoreline at sunrise with cold wind blowing across the water and a coffee thermos tucked under my arm. At 68 years old, I had finally learned something simple. Peace and loneliness can look almost identical from a distance. The judge finalized the divorce 2 weeks after the hearing. Fair settlement, no ugly surprises. Linda kept the Wilmington house because, truthfully, I didn't want it anymore. Too many ghosts lived there. I moved into a small rented cabin near Swansboro, not far from the marshes. 1-bedroom, tiny kitchen, porch swing out front, quiet. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel hostile. I started sleeping better too. Not perfect, but better. Some mornings I'd wake before dawn, drive into town and volunteer at the Veterans Center near Jacksonville. Mostly paperwork help. Insurance forms, VA claims, rides to doctor appointments. A lot of older veterans get lost in those systems. Truthfully, some just need somebody willing to sit beside them a while. One Tuesday afternoon, I looked up from a stack of intake forms and nearly dropped my reading glasses. Linda stood in the doorway holding a cardboard tray of coffees. The room got awkward immediately. A few of the older Marines recognized her from the hearing. One elbowed another and muttered something under his breath. Linda noticed. To her credit, she walked in anyway. I brought coffee, she said quietly. Nobody answered at first. Then old Walt Jenkins, retired Navy, 82 years old, mean as a snake but soft-hearted underneath, pointed toward an empty table. "Well," he grumbled, "don't just stand there blocking the doorway." That broke the tension enough for people to chuckle. Linda began volunteering after that. At first only once a week, then more often. She helped organize clothing donations, answered phones, and assisted elderly spouses filling out paperwork. One afternoon I watched her sit beside a Vietnam widow for nearly an hour, just listening quietly, while the woman cried about losing her husband years earlier. Linda caught me watching afterward. "What?" she asked self-consciously. "Nothing. But truthfully, it meant something to me. Not because I expected us to reconcile romantically. That chapter had ended. Some things break too slowly over too many years to fully repair. But respect can sometimes come back. And strangely enough, friendship can too. Our son Michael noticed the change immediately. I can actually talk to both of you again without feeling like I'm walking through a minefield, he joked during Sunday dinner one evening. We'd started gathering together occasionally for family meals again, mostly because of our granddaughter Emma. Emma was 10 years old and asked direct questions the way only children can. "Grandpa," she asked one afternoon while helping me fish off the pier, "were you really a hero?" I nearly snorted coffee through my nose. "No, ma'am. But Judge Morgan said you save people." I baited her hook carefully before answering. "Doing your job doesn't make you a hero." She frowned thoughtfully. "Then what does?" That question sat with me a while. Finally I said, "Probably being kind when nobody's watching." Emma seemed satisfied with that. Kids understand simple truths better than adults sometimes. A few weeks later, her school held a Veterans Day assembly. Nothing fancy. Elementary school gymnasium, with folding chairs and bad acoustics. Paper flags taped to walls. Coffee in styrofoam cups. Honestly, my favorite kind of American gathering. Emma begged me to attend after finding out veterans would be recognized during the ceremony. I almost declined. Crowds still wear me out. But she gave me that look granddaughters use when they already know you're going to say yes eventually. So I went. Linda came too. We sat beside each other awkwardly near the back of the gym, while children fidgeted through patriotic songs, slightly off-key. Then the principal stepped to the microphone. "We'd also like to welcome a special guest speaker today," she announced. "Please welcome Judge Harold Morgan." I blinked in surprise as Morgan walked onto the little stage wearing a dark suit and carrying note cards. He spotted me immediately and smiled. That man always did enjoy ambushing me. Morgan spoke for several minutes about service, sacrifice, and community. Nothing political, nothing dramatic, just honest. Then near the end he paused. "I'd like to tell you all something important," he said. The gym quieted. A few months ago I watched a courtroom full of people underestimate someone because he looked like an ordinary old man. I already, clear his throat, knew where this was going and immediately wanted to crawl under my chair. Linda elbowed me gently. "Too late now," she whispered. Morgan continued. "But strength rarely announces itself loudly. In my experience, the strongest people are often the quietest people in the room." Then he looked directly at me. "Frank Dalton, would you stand for a moment?" I sighed heavily, while Emma practically bounced out of her seat with excitement. As I stood slowly, the room erupted into applause. Not wild cheering, something softer, more meaningful. Teachers, students, veterans, parents, people simply standing to acknowledge a tired old Marine who had spent most of his life believing nobody really saw him anymore. I glanced toward Linda. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of guilt. They looked more like understanding. After the ceremony ended, Emma slipped her small hand into mine while we walked outside beneath the fading afternoon sun. "Grandpa," she whispered proudly, "everybody likes you." I laughed softly. "Well, don't trust crowds too much," she grinned. Later that evening, Linda came by the cabin carrying a small wooden box. "I found this while cleaning the attic," she said. Inside sat my old folded American flag from retirement, carefully preserved, untouched. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said the words I think both of us needed most. "I'm sorry I stopped seeing you clearly." I nodded slowly. "And I'm sorry I stopped letting you." The sun dipped low over the marsh outside. Gold light filled the porch. Together, we carefully unfolded the flag for Emma and showed her how to fold it properly into a triangle, the way my father once taught me. 3 generations standing quietly together at sunset. Maybe that was enough. And if this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a veteran, a spouse, a parent, or simply a quiet person carrying burdens nobody else can see, I hope you'll take a moment to tell them they matter while there's still time. Because sometimes the people holding families together the longest are the very people the world notices last.